All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Jordan, and I'll be acting as host for today's discussion. And first, I want to thank our media sponsors, KCBW, for recording and rebroadcasting this event as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is an institute at the University of Utah. It seeks to provide an array of transformative experiences to students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums such as this seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most pressing and current issues. We are pleased to be joined today by our members from the American College of National Security Leaders in today's panel, Afghanistan, informing the debate. Our panelists, retired Senior Executive Service Member Mr. Robert McBrien, retired Lieutenant General Karen Gibson of the U.S. Army, and retired Ambassador Gerald Feierstein. Welcome to the U. Today's discussion will be moderated by retired Major General Donna Barbisch of the U.S. Army and CEO of the American College of National Security Leaders. All questions will be taken after the discussion. I'll now turn the time over to General Peter Cook for introductions.
Well, I'm not going to do any introductions other than to thank Jason Perry and the Hinckley Institute and the great interns that Gina we get that's really been the backbone for our college. Jason's great idea for the future is that the university is going to have the concept of trying to get more people interested in public service. We need that so strongly in our country now, dynamic young people that are willing to take on this great leadership, this opportunity. And you'll start to see and follow Jason as he begins to bring this opportunity to the University of Utah. He has a dynamic opportunity with a great source. We have, in our college, we have over 100 plus retired ambassadors, generals, admirals, and those that have served as SES. And we'll hear about those people that have done public service and have their own special category with their own flag. And they're the backbone of our country. So today is going to be a great treat. And I want to thank you, Jason, for this and what will happen in the future. Natalie Tibbetts is always behind the scenes, but that is one lady that can get everything done. She's magnificent. And thank you so much, Gina, for those great interns. The best interns I think I've seen in the country that come out and represent both this university and the opportunity to help others. And you saw an example of that with Jason today, Sam in the back, who have really helped us. So I'm going to turn this over now to retired Major General Donna Barbisch, who is the CEO, runs the college, and here's Donna. It's all yours.
Well, thank you, General Cook. Very nice to be here with all of you today. Thank you for having us, Jason, and everybody that we've worked with. For the past, I've been with the college for 7 months now, and we are reorganizing and looking forward to the future. And this opportunity to be here today started with our own interns from last summer. Jace, who was just here and introduced us back in the corner, Sam Haney, who's up here in this corner, one of our other interns who had to back out at the last minute, Lauren, and another young man that was with us earlier. It's been really amazing to get to know all of you, and we really appreciate what you're doing for us and for our country. This is a very important topic we're talking about today, Afghanistan. But we're not talking about Afghanistan from the perspective of what you read in the news in the last few weeks, or how we may or may not have addressed every single issue that the news media is bringing out. Our goals today are to look at what is national security? How does it work? What are the challenges? National security is considered what is called a wicked problem. No right or wrong answers, only better or worse. And everything in wicked problems have second and third order effects that may or may not be what you were aiming at. What we're going to do today is talk you through some of the things that we worked with over the past 20 years. We're using Afghanistan as our platform to help you understand or gain insights into what maybe you're curious about. We're here to answer questions as well, if you have specific questions that don't make sense. But I think what I want personally, and what our college is trying to do as we grow the next generation of national security leaders, people that serve the government in this great country, what we want to do is challenge your assumptions. What is war? What is peace? What does it mean to win? And what are we talking about in the media that's really important that you need to understand? How can you be a better citizen? Whether you actually want to work in government or not, every citizen has the right and the responsibility to be part of the future. So we're putting a framework around this using Afghanistan to help you understand, if you don't already, what it is that we have worked with throughout these last 20 years. Now together, as we look at our panelists here, we have over 150 years of experience. That's pretty scary. But, so we're here to share some of our insights and take a look at what this transformation to peace and prosperity might look like. We are not in the blame game. This isn't about who did what wrong. Although if you have questions, we can help provide insight on that. But what we're looking at is how do we do this better in the future? How are we going to move national security to the forefront of all Americans so that we can have a better and more prosperous United States? Now let's take a look at this Afghan war and the timeline. Some of you may not have even been born on 9/11. Why were we there? Why is it called the longest war? We went in to take a look and find the terrorists that attacked our country. Is that what we did? Is that what we didn't do? What happened throughout these years? And in 2004, we had democratic elections in Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan has never had a central government. So that's an important factoid that you need to remember. No central government. How can you lead a country with no central government? You can see here that, I'm trying to read the numbers that are too far away from me, 2003, where we said combat operations have ceased. So what happened then? 9/11, let's take a look. Every time we thought we were done, there was a resurgence. That little graph shows you that the numbers would go down and then we'd be attacked. Not we, the country. And take a look at this. Was it the United States that did it all? Was it NATO? When were we involved in, just because the United States is the strongest country in NATO and leads many of the coalition events, what really happened? And if you look at 2020, when we just said our last withdrawal was going to happen, 18 months before we actually left. So keep those stats in mind as we go forward and take a look at how this all works from a government perspective. If you look at the country, the world, and those of you that have studied political science may know, you'll see, and I'm not sure how clear it is up there, the broad categories, those are our military combatant commands. So the military divides the whole world up into combatant commands, and that person, the senior combatant commander, has jurisdiction over military operations in those areas. The colored areas represent the Department of State bureaus. The Department of State bureaus don't align well with or don't always align, some of them do, with our combatant commands. Factoid, complications, areas of responsibility, who's in charge of what. Now let's take a look at Afghanistan. We pull that country that's landlocked in the middle of the slide, and then we take a look at that and put it into perspective. A country slightly smaller than Texas, with so many different challenges. We've got numerous languages, numerous cultures, numerous religions. We have limited fresh water, inadequate supplies for potable water. There's desertification, air quality issues, 14 different ethnic groups. The life expectancy in Afghanistan is 52 years old. Education expenditure, 4% of the GDP, 4%. And literacy, 43%. Now, how as an uneducated country do we help the population get to where they want to be? So I'm going to turn it over now to our panelists who have, hit the wrong button, sorry. Our panelists who you heard before, Ambassador Jerry Feierstein, Feinstein, I always pronounce his name wrong. Mr. Bob McBrien, a senior executive from the Department of Treasury. Senior executive service is equivalent to a general or an admiral or ambassador level. And then Lieutenant General Karen Gibson, both she and I were Army. Let me tell you just a brief little bit. I can pull up my head so I don't screw this up. General Gibson came into the Army as an intelligence officer. She spent her career across the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii, and in Central Command, primarily. I'm going to let them fill in blanks if there's something I miss on their background. But General Karen, Ms. Gibson is now the Sergeant of Arms at the U.S. Capitol.
Yeah, that's sad.
And her last assignment was Deputy Commander for U.S. Cyber Command. Ambassador Feierstein spent 41 years with the State Department, focused on the Middle East. He's going to share a lot of insights into his experience there. And then Bob McBrien, a lawyer who started out with counterterrorism and fighting those issues that are so critical to our nation. I'll let Bob tell us a little bit more about himself here. So with that, let's move on to State Department perspective. Jerry.
Thanks, Donna. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. And what I wanted to do is follow up on a couple of the comments that Donna made early on in her presentation, particularly to make the point that what you've heard a lot of the chatter in Washington about who is responsible for the end state in Afghanistan was their clear communications and understanding between State Department, Defense Department, U.S. military about what we expected to happen, how we were going to respond, how we were going to take care of American citizens in Afghanistan, how we were going to take care of the number of Afghans who had worked very closely with our forces and with others over the course of the conflict there. So what you need to take away from all of that is that a lot of that argument, a lot of that conversation that's going on in Washington is really a Washington conversation that only has a very limited relationship to the way the situation works on the ground in not only in the Afghanistan, Pakistan area of responsibility, but even more broadly, globally. How do embassies work? What is the organization of an embassy? How does the U.S. government take care of the coordination and the implementation of policy on the ground in foreign countries? So just to lay out very briefly the country team approach, which exists everywhere where the United States has a diplomatic presence, which is just about everywhere with very few exceptions, Iran, North Korea, and one or two other places, but otherwise we are represented everywhere in the world, and any embassy that you go into is going to have a country team approach, with the understanding that the ambassador, as the president's personal representative in that country, is responsible for all of the aspects of U.S. policy in that country, and all of the elements of the U.S. executive branch that are in that country report to and through the ambassador back to their own headquarters, back to Washington. And so you have a mechanism on the ground in all of these countries that is responsible for overseeing the implementation and making sure that the kinds of questions that we're hearing in Washington right now about why did the various institutions and agencies not understand each other and what was happening, purpose of the country team is to make sure that that's not what happens on the ground, that nobody misunderstands what their responsibilities are, what the direction is that comes from Washington, from the headquarters, but through the ambassador as the coordinator. The single exception, and we'll come back to that because it's important here, is the only exception to the ambassador's responsibility to oversee all of the U.S. government operations in the country is when you have military units working under the direct command of a combatant commander. And it goes back to the point that Donna made about the combatant commands and their responsibilities. So if you are in a conflict situation, like we were in Afghanistan, like we were in Iraq, where you have U.S. military forces that are under the direct command, in this instance of the Central Command, then those forces do not answer to the ambassador for obvious reasons. The ambassador can't be in the position of telling a division that we want you to go attack this location. The ambassador may want to do that, and some of them may actually be able to do that, but it's not a good idea. And so the combatant commander maintains control over all of those forces, but with the understanding that what you want to have happen is very close coordination between the combatant command and the ambassador. The best example of that that you might have seen, that you might have been aware of, is in the mid-2000s in Iraq, where you had David Petraeus as the commander of U.S. military forces during the surge in Iraq, and Ryan Crocker as the ambassador. And the two of them worked hand in glove. They were joined at the hip, as you say, while they were working on that surge together. They came back to Washington. They went up to the Hill together to testify and to explain to the Congress what it was that we were trying to accomplish. And the fact that they were so closely aligned and understanding of one another and what each was trying to accomplish was an important element of why the surge in Iraq worked out as successfully as it did. And so the question, and I think we'll come back to it over the course of this conversation, is whether that happened in Afghanistan as well. If it didn't happen in Afghanistan, why not? And what were the implications for that in terms of how we went forward and how our Afghanistan mission ended. I wanted to share with you a couple of quick examples of what we're talking about. And I wanted to talk about two places where I served. One was Pakistan. And again, one of the points that we want to drive home to you is the football game is about to start. One of the things that I wanted to bring home to you is that if you're talking about Afghanistan, you can't just talk about Afghanistan. Afghanistan doesn't exist in a vacuum. Afghanistan was part of a larger effort that the United States was trying to achieve that drew in Pakistan as Afghanistan's neighbor, as a critical partner for the United States in trying to implement our policies in Afghanistan. But it was a critical partner that had strong issues with U.S. policy that was not entirely on board with what we were trying to accomplish. And so as the embassy in Islamabad, what were they trying to accomplish in order to help us achieve our objectives in Afghanistan? One, as the embassy in Islamabad, understanding that, as Donna said, Afghanistan is a landlocked country, meaning that the majority of supplies that came into our military forces operating inside of Afghanistan couldn't come directly into Afghanistan. You could fly it in, but flying it in is extremely expensive. Some of the equipment doesn't actually fit into an airplane. A lot of it is bulk, and therefore it would require a lot of aircraft to try to do it. And so how do you bring it in? You bring it in by ship. But if Afghanistan is landlocked, there's no port. So where do you come in? All of the material that came in to support our military operating in Afghanistan came through the port in Karachi. And a lot of what the embassy in Islamabad was doing was making sure that we were working closely with the Pakistanis so that when our equipment came into the port in Karachi, it moved out of the port quickly, got put onto trucks, and taken up across the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan into Afghanistan. We had military personnel in the embassy working on a 24/7 basis to make sure that that happened. So that was one of the things that we were doing. We also were working extremely closely with our embassy inside of Afghanistan and Kabul to try to do a couple of things. One, to make sure that the Pakistanis understood what our objectives were, what our policy was, and to make sure that they acted in a way that was consistent with what we were trying to do. Again, this was a requirement that took a lot of work by our ambassador in Pakistan at the time to work on a regular basis with the Pakistanis, but we also regularly brought across from Kabul our ambassador in Afghanistan to help explain what our policy was. We had personnel who were working in our embassy, who were working with colleagues on the other side of the border in Afghanistan to try to address some of the issues along the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which was a major part of the terrorism threat that we were confronting with the effort to defeat and dismantle Al-Qaeda that straddled the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And we also, of course, through the intelligence community, worked very closely with the Pakistanis in trying to identify where Al-Qaeda was operating, and of course to undertake operations to try to eliminate the senior leadership of Al-Qaeda that was taking safe haven inside of Pakistan. And the other part of it was that we worked very closely with the commander of the military forces inside of Afghanistan, again, to make sure that everything was being addressed, and we were moving forward in a way that was supportive of what our military was trying to accomplish. But then the last, and I'll be very brief here, I also wanted to draw your attention to Yemen, which to make the point fundamentally that what I'm describing about what we were doing in Pakistan was not unique to that kind of environment, but that what we did in Pakistan was very similar to what we were doing in Yemen, where again the U.S. government major initiative, major foreign policy and national security interest in Yemen was fighting against the terrorist threat that was coming out of Yemen, the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which was responsible for several attempted terror attacks here in the United States. And so again, working as a country team, working as the embassy, the military components of the embassy, and the intelligence units operating in the embassy, what we did with the government of Yemen in order to try again to implement our national security objectives and to defeat Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and to prevent them from being able to continue with their efforts to attack the United States. So again, to make the fundamental point that this integrated role of U.S. executive branch agencies in a country abroad, following the leadership of both the policy direction that they're getting from their headquarters, but also coordinating through the ambassador back to their headquarters, was an essential element. And so the key takeaway from my perspective that we want to drive home here is that state DoD intelligence cooperation on the ground in the field is essential. Generally speaking, it's positive. Most of the issues that come up are worked, and that is an essential element of how we advance U.S. national security on the ground.
Thank you, Jerry. That was very enlightening, and I hope we'll have a lot of questions from that in just a little while. Our next speaker, Mr. McBrien, and if you'll notice that little map there, it colors where at one point in time we thought a lot of the terrorists were. Now, how do you find them everywhere? And we have one big bullet in the money. So we're going to turn it over now to Bob to share with us what Treasury was doing, what he was intimately involved in fighting terrorism.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go off script pretty quickly here, but if we get the next slide up, that'll, this is useful. That's where I came from, and that lays out our basic structural placement here. If you think, we began by talking about war and peace. If you think about looking at the bureaucracy of government dealing with those subjects, I start with diplomacy on one end and war on another end. And then there's some sort of spectrum in between. Sanctions, which are what I did and what my organization does today, aren't really in that spectrum in any one spot. In fact, I kind of call them quantum sanctions. They move depending upon what's needed and where it's needed and what we're doing most of. In the sanctions basically have one purpose, and that is to deny a foreign adversary finance and trade. We have what are called blocking measures, where we lock up their money, and we have prohibitions, where transactions with them are prohibited. And then we have means of helping stop all of that. Now, I'll make one reference to something I worked on for most of my career in sanctions, and that was what we call the SDN list. And that's a mechanism where we define who the enemy is, who the adversary is, by naming their front companies and their agents and their offices and their intelligence operatives and their terrorists throughout the world. It's not limited to Afghanistan or necessarily, even in the case of Afghanistan. But going back to that spectrum, as I said, this is quantum sanctions. If we go to look back at the timeline that was put up of our involvement in Afghanistan, and if we skip up to my timeline, can we do that? No, I've got, yes, that one. I can't read it from here. In my timeline, you're going to notice several things that are really historical. 1995 is the first terrorism executive order. And an executive order is how sanctions are usually imposed. They're imposed, in most cases, by the President of the United States. He declares a national emergency based upon his determination that there's an unusual and extraordinary threat to the U.S. foreign policy, national security, or economy. Usually it's a combination of those factors that define it, but that's presidential authority. The first terrorism executive order putting sanctions against terrorists was in 1995. And yes, the U.S. did things under executive order. We did that. A very great deal of what we did was against Hamas. But that's not what we're here about. Then you'll notice that in 1998, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were added to that terrorism list from 1995. So they became subject to it. But they weren't on the original list. And they were made part of the sanctions program against terrorism. Not that much later, in 1999, the Taliban came under sanctions. And the Taliban came under sanctions because they were providing safe haven and an operating base to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And the U.S. decided to do what sanctions do best, to leverage them by cutting off trade and cutting off financial transactions with them. Now, Afghanistan's a pretty poor place, so that has an impact. It didn't seem to faze the Taliban very much, but we had those sanctions in place nonetheless, and we started naming persons and entities under that authority. A full 24 months later, 2 years, 2 months, is when we have 9/11. And it's after 9/11 that an executive order is developed, a second executive order on terrorism that's called the Global Executive Order, where we kind of took them on everywhere in the world rather just in the Middle East, which is what the first one was about. That executive order went into effect, and then in the same time frame that we were talking about, and you also need to look back at the time frame that was put first by General Barbisch. In that, U.S. had combat operations begin. We had the embassy compound change utterly in Afghanistan into a very big operation, along with the International Security Assistance Force. With all of that going on, and after the initial attack that deposed the Taliban as the authority, then in a moment of which I'll simply refer to as mission accomplished, the sanctions on the Taliban were withdrawn because it no longer controlled any territory in Afghanistan. But at that time, we then put the Taliban as an organization on the terrorism list. So, We've gone from 1995 to today in dealing with Afghanistan and dealing with the Taliban. And that's another example of the scope of how sanctions and measures against a foreign adversary, in this case, the Taliban, have developed, and also the lifespan of them. Also important is that it's not war dependent. Those sanctions were not put on the Taliban because we were at war. They were put on the Taliban because it was giving safe haven to someone whom we yet did not know would be doing something so dramatically against the United States. There was no hint at the time that sanctions executive order was created what Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda would want to do or actually accomplish with respect to the United States. Those sanctions on the Taliban remain today. It's still sanctioned as a terrorist organization, which is one of the impediments to it being able to get international capital or any international assistance. So there are exceptions made in these laws so that humanitarian relief can get in there. That in itself becomes a problem because, frankly, the Taliban hasn't changed, and there's no indication that the foreign assistance and foreign humanitarian aid is actually going to get in through the Taliban. I have my own sources in Afghanistan right now who are reporting to me that when assistance, food assistance comes in, the food assistance is handed out to those people who are allied with the Taliban, and that it's not passed out to anyone else. Now, I'd like to run back talking about my spectrum of where we do and don't fit in the sanctions realm. What OFAC does, what sanctions do is they start at the top. They're presidential action. So in a normal case, more often than not, there are three places that know that sanctions are even being considered before they actually happen. That's the White House, the National Security Council, the State Department, and Treasury. Very frequently, in my experience, the first hint of sanctions was a phone call to Treasury, to what was called OFAC, that come over and talk to us. Now, why is that? Well, one is that it's a presidential decision, and they want it very closely held because, one, it hurts to leak them in advance. They're not as effective. And two, if the president chooses not to do it, you don't want anything out there about maybe he would have. Those are two big reasons. Third is that sanctions are very technical. So they want to get the technical people in right away so they don't embarrass themselves as they go along. And embarrassment as you go along is having to change the sanctions endlessly. And that has happened. And everybody who's experienced that knows they don't want it to happen again. The other reason, which may be laughable, but it's real, is that Treasury gets called right away because there's physical proximity. Treasury is across the street. You just trot across Pennsylvania Avenue and go to the Situation Room and have your meeting. And that really matters a lot. These folks from the State Department actually have to come over from Foggy Bottom to be in the meeting. And if somebody has a sudden idea, let's do this, and there are presidents who do that, the meeting happens like that. So that's how they get started. Now, another thing about sanctions is that they are top down. They begin, as I said, at the top. The president is going to do them. Even if Congress passes a law that creates sanctions, most of those laws, there are few that aren't, most of those laws have to have an executive order to go with them. They aren't written to be self-enacting. They don't operationalize on their own. The president has to come in and take an action to actually make them work. Otherwise, they're mainly sound good paper that gets everybody excited, but nothing can happen. So once again, you have top down from the White House into Treasury and State to start the whole process. There are programs that a lot of other actors have to be involved in at the top from the beginning and throughout the program. There's a narcotics program under a separate statute, Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act. That has a large number of parties involved every step of the way in what's done there. DOD is part of that. And I think with that, I will wrap up here. Gentlemen.
Thanks. So thanks for having us. It's a pleasure to be here and to share our experiences. You know, my experience, the lens through which I'm going to be discussing things is military operations. So as Bob talked about, you know, we have diplomacy and then we have war. I'm more on the war side, although I have worked with Department of State closely in all of those operations. I served in the U.S. Army for 33 years. I supported operations in Afghanistan, either deployed to or supporting them for about 10 years. The lens through which I'm going to be talking about primarily is my own experience forward in Kabul at the 4-star NATO headquarters, as well as my time at U.S. Central Command. Eventually, I was the Director of Intelligence there, responsible for the intelligence that supports military operations from Egypt to Pakistan, Yemen to Kazakhstan, all the garden spots, but really a fascinating part of the world to work in. You know, we're talking about inspiring people for public service careers. I had no intention of making a military career. It was absolutely not my plan. I grew up in Montana, 300 miles north of here, and got accepted to Purdue University. My dad said, congratulations. I even paid that out-of-state tuition. And Army ROTC sounded like a pretty good deal to me. And, you know, for just 4 years of free college, I go 4 years in the Army, and then I could go do my own thing. What I did not anticipate was that I would absolutely fall in love with being an American soldier. And I could think of nothing else that I wanted to do with myself, and frankly, I still can't. I'm just kind of too old for it now. So at any rate, it could happen to anyone. And why intelligence? Well, you know, back when I joined the Army, women, girls, were not allowed to serve in real combat arms fields, and I thought that as an intelligence officer, that would offer me the closest opportunity, the opportunity to get as close to the fight as possible. To be in the tent with the commander and the director of operations, or the chief of fires, as we're bending over the map board, talking about the day's events, what's going to happen tomorrow. It would be my job to tell them what the adversary was up to. And I absolutely loved that role. And so my favorite years of my career were those where I was deployed downrange to places like this. You know, one of the things that, and let me just briefly pause to kind of explain, we also have a spectrum, you know, within DOD of everything from very tactical operations, you know, perhaps you're on a patrol in Marja, or you're defending a combat outpost in the Korangal Valley in eastern Afghanistan. That's tactical operations. You know, sending and receiving direct fire with the Taliban or others. And then we have a very strategic level, the National Security Council, the Pentagon. I served in what we call the operational level of war, which is in the middle. So I was at the forward headquarters in Kabul or later in Baghdad, or serving at U.S. Central Command. And I thought that was really the sweet spot, and I enjoyed it very much. We're very much working with other elements of the government. So, you know, Ambassador Feierstein talked about DOD, Department of State relationship. You know, I had in Baghdad, not Afghanistan, I would meet with the ambassador once a week, and every morning a rep from my staff would go to the ambassador's office over at the embassy, lay out a map on his coffee table, and talk about what had happened that day. So it is absolutely a partnership. And you are working with other branches of government too. In Afghanistan, we had a lot of folks from DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, who were there to help with the counter-drug campaign because the Taliban got an awful lot of their funding from the opium trade. We also had members of, I've worked with the Department of Energy on nuclear weapon things, or Department of Treasury on sanctions, or Department of Justice, especially the FBI and sometimes even the DHS. So it is very much a whole of government kind of effort. One of the things I like most about being at that operational level of war, being downrange, is that you get to work with your counterparts, if not every day, at least every week, in a way that in Washington, D.C. you don't. And you are all pretty much aligned on a common goals and objectives, and you're sort of freed of some of those bureaucratic fights that occur at the executive level back in Washington. I think another thing I enjoy about operating forward in particular is many people don't realize how closely we're working with coalition, other nations there. I had either Canadian or British deputies for 6 years, and I worked for a series of Australian generals and admirals, 3 of them. So it's not strictly an American thing. If I wanted to go to northern Afghanistan, I flew in a Luftwaffe aircraft with German pilots, and the Italians were running our IT networks. So it is more of a coalition, multinational effort than many people understand. The military, of course, is just one instrument of power. We've talked about diplomacy and about sanctions, which can be very powerful. It tends to be the largest. It is the most expensive. It's sometimes the flashiest. It makes for the most intriguing visual news clips. And so you see a lot of it, but we aren't always the primary effort. Certainly initially in Afghanistan we were. Initially in Afghanistan, our aims were to defeat Al-Qaeda, which I would argue we did fairly quickly. Yes, they still exist, but largely in caves or holed up in places where they can't get out, and they have not been able to plan or execute any operations in the United States in decades. All they've been able to do is inspire what we call radical homegrown violent extremists to conduct terror acts in the United States. So our first goal, defeat Al-Qaeda. Second, overthrow the Taliban. Did that in 2 months. And then the third, capture or kill Osama bin Laden. That was much tougher. That took about 10 years, in part because he was hiding or living in Pakistan. Those were clearly military operations, and the military was the main effort. But at that point, it switched. And certainly the bulk of our resources and the money that we spend was still in the military arm. But then it became more about nation building and counterinsurgency, which has a strong military component. But if you think back to that early slide of Donna's that showed the increase in attacks that began to happen as the Taliban insurgency grew in strength, they continued to be some significant military operations, even well after we had actually, at least initially, defeated the Taliban. By the time I got to U.S. Central Command, even though most of what you would hear about typically on the news, if Afghanistan was on there at all, was military operations, the Department of State actually had the lead. And Ambassador Zal Khalilzad, who just left government service very recently, his project of conducting a negotiation with the Taliban was our government's primary effort. And at U.S. Central Command, we were told and understood that we were the secondary effort, and that our job was to establish security conditions in Afghanistan that would allow him to accomplish the best possible negotiations with the Taliban. I think a final point I'll make, probably before we open up kind of for questions, is to talk about how, in addition to being a whole of government and a multinational effort, a part of that whole of government is the intelligence community. And the U.S. intelligence community is very vast, 16 or 17 different independent agencies, billions of dollars that are spent, and they all had a role as well. So whether that was the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which provided us with insights into what was happening in Pakistan that no one else would understand, to the National Security Agency, which collects, exploits, intercepts, and helps us understand how people are communicating, which can help in the day of cell phones now to actually geolocating and finding folks like Osama bin Laden. The National Geospatial Agency, which does imagery analysis and provides great images and maps to help us conduct our operations. NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, which is flying the satellites, satellite constellations overhead that allow all of those different kinds of information operations, as well as a plethora of airborne platforms, aircraft that DoD and other agencies have. And sometimes those are collecting signals intelligence or taking pictures. Other times they have other kinds of sensors on them, multispectral, hyperspectral, and they can do things like detect large concentrations of calcium ammonium nitrate, You'll find that on a tarp in someone's backyard, perhaps they are producing explosives for IEDs. And then really one of the most important sources of information in terms of intelligence is the information that comes from battlefield commanders and those who are interacting with our Afghan partners that tell you exactly what is happening on the ground where they are operating. Much of the intelligence community, especially the defense intelligence establishment and enterprise, is really optimized to supporting conventional military operations. You know, how many tanks are left? Okay, the Taliban didn't have a lot of tanks, but ISIS had about 9 of them that they captured. How many tanks are left? Where are their artillery? Where are their headquarters? Where is an adversary, a conventional adversary, planning a missile strike? Where did an explosion happen? Those kinds of capabilities, it is a lot harder to infer the truth and what's really going on in a counterinsurgency using those kinds of capabilities. And I'll just share, it gets a lot tricky, I'll just share one anecdote, and then I think we'll be able to open to questions. So when I showed up in Kabul in 2012, I showed up at the headquarters, and it was shortly after General Petraeus had left. And we had this army of forces, if you know what those are, operational research, systems analysis folks. We were counting everything. We were measuring everything. We were putting out charts and graphs and heat maps, especially of where IEDs were going off or incidents with troops in contact. And it was like counting girls in school, electricity generation, you know, how many people have jobs. And it felt to me, as a brand new person, you know how you notice things when you're the new person. And then after you've been there about 30 days, it all seems normal. But when I first got there, it seemed to me like it was this giant Willy Wonka machine, just covered with knobs and dials, and we're counting and measuring everything. And if we can just get all the knobs tuned just right, this thing, instead of spitting out a candy bar, it's going to spit out victory, and we can all go home. We're just trying to measure things until we get to just the right sweet spot. Then General Dunford came in as the 4-star commander, and some of you may know him, especially if you have served as a Marine before. And he said, you know what? I don't care about it. We were spending a lot of time counting IEDs that were going off and where they were going off. He said, I don't care about that. He said, let them worry about that at the tactical headquarters. I want you to tell me about the confidence of the Afghan people in their government. And I thought, that is a tough question. That's the right question. That's the right question to be asking at this strategic level. What is the confidence of the Afghan people in their government? Because really, at that point, it was becoming a battle for legitimacy. Security is a component of that, but it was really becoming a battle for legitimacy. And I will tell you, all those airborne aircraft and all those tools that I described that the intelligence community uses to assess what's happening in another country, particularly in a war, are not real good at measuring confidence of people in their own government. And so I just present this as one of those kinds of challenges in this difficult kind of fight is how we take tools that may have been designed for something like nation-state conflict with something like Russia or Iran and employ them in a different kind of environment like a counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. There are a lot of things that made the fight in Afghanistan complicated and the withdrawal, but I just offered that as one anecdote to perhaps give some insight into why it was such a tricky, or as Donna says, a wicked problem.
Thank you for that. Insightful, interesting, complicated, wicked problems. So what we have and what we've described is why things work, why they don't work, where they could be, where they might have been. And now what we want to know from you is, what questions do you have? So we're going to open it up now. Jace has a microphone back. I think there might be another one somewhere. But we're capturing this for our video, so if you would wait for the microphone, or if you want to speak up, we'll just repeat your question. Here's some of the things we talked about. So take a look at that and tell me what your questions are. We've got quite a few years, as I mentioned, working on this kind of complicated wicked problems, and nothing is easy.
And right before we open up the questions, these can be questions regarding the topics we talked about, but also careers in the public service. They represent a whole of government approach. So if you have questions specific to the State Department, the Treasury, the military, please ask those as well if you're interested.
Hi there, I have a quick question for the ambassador. What diplomatic or even economic incentives did we give to Pakistan to cooperate?
It's a very good question. And when I was there, so I was there from 2008 to 2010. And just to go back, and probably you know that we have a long and very uneven history with Pakistan, particularly along the lines of what you're asking, which is the economic development funds, the other kinds of funds that we've given to Pakistan over the years. When I was there, it was the transition from the George W. Bush administration to the Obama administration. And at that time, when Joe Biden was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, working with his counterpart on the Republican side, Dick Lugar, they came up with a policy called the Biden-Lugar plan. When Joe Biden became the vice president, he handed off the chairmanship of the committee to John Kerry, and Kerry continued that, and it became the Kerry-Lugar plan. And it was a multi-billion-dollar proposal for economic assistance to Pakistan. There was a big component of it for Afghanistan as well, and one of the complications and one of the issues that our embassy worked on a lot over the years is that because of the complexities of the government of Pakistan, there were suspicions. There's always a very high level of suspicion in Pakistan about what the United States is trying to do, and not a lot of confidence in that what we're trying to accomplish is in fact good for the Pakistanis. And the military became convinced that the Kerry-Lugar plan was actually aimed at undermining their influence in the government of Pakistan and strengthening the role of the civilian government. Now, obviously, that would be something that we would love to see in Pakistan, but that wasn't actually what we were trying to accomplish. But the whole issue of the Kerry-Lugar plan became extremely contentious between the U.S. and the Pakistanis, and it became actually a stick that the Pakistanis used to complicate our ability to support what was going on in Afghanistan. So at the end of the day, even though that money was put on the table and it was available for issues like, for example, there's a terrible utility, there's a terrible problem with electricity in Pakistan. There was a lot of work on dams that needed to be done. So there were a lot of infrastructure issues in Pakistan. There was a lot of issues with things like education and basic health services and those kinds of things. And this money was intended to address all of those kinds of things. But because it became so contentious between ourselves and particularly the Pakistani military, that we never actually were able to implement this program. So, so the incentive was there, but it ended up, and this is how things become very complicated. The intention was to try to normalize the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan, to develop a stronger relationship based on our ability to help them address their economic problems. And instead it became a political problem between ourselves and the Pakistanis, and it ended up not being an incentive but being a disincentive.
While we're looking for the next question, go ahead, Jason. I just want to remind everybody that our organization is nonpartisan, and in every effort we try to be apolitical. So our experience and observations, because we are career people who were grew up in the system and not appointed by a president, but still fall under the commander-in-chief, those of us in the military, and as the president, as the lead government official, we have to follow what is being driven. So we don't all have a choice. We don't have a choice. It's better and safer.
Go ahead, next question.
Yes. I have two. The first is we said that this is a wicked problem. There are no right or wrong answers, only better or worse. With that in mind, it then brings in mind philosophy. We were going into a nation that had no understanding of freedom, liberty, or even a defined borders, an arbitrary border that was decided for the country, not that the country itself fit. It brings to mind Plato's allegory of the cave. What happens when you leave the cave and you see something you've never seen before and have no understanding of perceive? The second question is we hear nonstop that experience matters. You yourselves have said 150 combined years of experience. Yet, in this 20-year war, we ignored the lessons of Korea, Vietnam, and the monsters we made in the Taliban through the Mujahideen, including Osama bin Laden. Why then did that experience not matter in the outcome? Thank you.
I would just say I think there's a lot of cultural hubris. There are books. Afghanistan is known as the graveyard of empires, and we said, but this isn't going to happen to us. It happened to everybody else. It happened to the Brits. It happened to the Russians, the Soviet Union, but it's not going to happen to us because we're American. And all I can chalk it up to is some cultural hubris that was realized too late. I mean, even General Milley in his testimony says, we were culturally unaware. And those who served, as I know you did in Afghanistan, trying to train an Afghan National Security Force that is largely illiterate to use some of your own weapon systems that are technically complicated was probably not the best way to approach that. I think that there is a lot of room for lessons learned that will come in evaluating that. But my short answer to your answer would just plain and simple be hubris.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I agree with that fundamentally. There was a moment in time. I think you need to understand the domestic political context here in the United States at that particular moment, and there is a reality that if you're working on these issues, you need also to keep in mind, and that is Americans, when we're going into a country, when we're involved in some conflict situation, Americans do expect that their government is going to be working in a way that is going to improve the situation, that we're going to take into account issues like human rights, women's education, some of these other issues. Your question is absolutely correct. And one of the things that Donna and I were talking yesterday, and I made the point to her, which is that the irony of what happened for us in Afghanistan was that an awful lot of what we were trying to achieve was in fact exactly what the Soviet Union was trying to achieve when they went into Afghanistan in 1979. And it was, in a sense, a misunderstanding, and here's where I agree with what Karen said. It was a misunderstanding on our part about the nature of Afghan society. So there was absolutely that element. I would take a little bit of issue with one thing that you said, and that is this the question about our responsibility for the creation of the Taliban. I was the principal officer in Peshawar from 1989 to 92. So it was the period in between the withdrawal of the Soviets. They left in February of '89. I got to Peshawar in the summer of '89. the PDPA government, Najibullah's government, collapsed in the spring of '92 when I left in the summer of '92. So I was there for that entire period where we were working with the Afghan interim government, which were the Mujahideen parties that we were supporting. And as you said, the Taliban came almost entirely out of one of the parties that we were supporting, which was Yunus Khalis, the Hizb Islami Khalis. So you're right in the one point. But one thing that I always try to remind people when they ask this question is to think about the way we were seeing the region in 1978, 79, the time of the Soviet invasion. It was the same year, of course, as the fall of the Shah, the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it was the attack on the embassy in Islamabad, the attack on Libya, the murder of our ambassador in Kabul, Spike Dubs. And so there were a series of events, the hostage taking, of course, in Tehran. There were a series of events that occurred in 1979 that, frankly speaking, generated a sense of hysteria, really, in Washington about what was happening, where things were going. The Carter, that's when we had the Carter Doctrine, and the declaration that what happened in the Gulf was of direct national security importance to the United States. We had never said that before. And so when you think back to the decision train of why did we decide to support the Mujahideen, it was because there was a high level of concern that the Soviet Union was advancing. We had the Soviets had just come out with their Brezhnev Doctrine, which basically said that no government which has embraced Marxism will ever be allowed to retreat from that. And that was their rationalization for why they invaded Afghanistan. And so we were responding to what was seen as a series of critical setbacks in an area of the world that was essential for our security. And that was how we got into it. Now, in 2020 hindsight, is it easy to say why? Was it right to do that? Was it smart to do that? Maybe, maybe not. But if you're a decision maker in 1979, looking at the region, hard to question why you decided to do what you did.
I think in 2001 also, most of you probably, some of you remember, but most of you don't remember perhaps how emotionally jolting and scarring that attack was. And the thousands of Americans that were killed like that and the tens of thousands of Americans that were affected, the lives that were irretrievably changed and the need to do something. And so, that 2001 go in, defeat Al-Qaeda, overthrow the Taliban, find and capture Osama bin Laden. There was no singularly inept decision. It was over time then, as I think we've tried to describe, that over time, the follow-on solution that began to fail, and I would say, just back to the, cultural hubris, the lack of awareness of Afghan culture. Two things on that. One, we used to say, even when I was there, hey, we say we're here to bring you democracy, but if the Taliban took over America, they'd say, you poor Americans, we're here to make sure you have justice. Because, just a different value system for your average, especially costume. But also, I think we didn't really understand the levels of corruption that we were enabling by pouring money in for nation building. And that when we poured that money in for nation building, Afghanistan worked, if that's what you want to call it, based on these tribal loyalties that then become disrupted when you infuse large amounts of cash in new places. Just one final short little thing I'll offer. When I was in Djibouti in Afghanistan, we came in, fresh-faced American soldiers. We're here to help the locals. Hey, they need another well over here. We're going to dig a well. There's only one in this area. We're going to dig a well. And we almost started a civil war in that little area because we didn't understand that the existing well was owned by the tribal chieftain, and now we've created a whole nother market that has upset his power structure. So that's on a micro level, kind of what we did not understand was going to start happening in Afghanistan when we started to pour tons of money into the nation to try to make it better. Anyway, thanks. Long answer to your short question.
I would just ask one further comment on the issue of wicked problems. Go back and challenge your assumption of war. Vietnam, Korea, everything was very different. Nobody attacked us on our soil. That's one big difference. And then we were at war throughout the entire time in Vietnam. We weren't into nation building back then. Korea actually hasn't ever ended, so I question your assumption of the longest war, because we had a ceasefire in Korea, but we have never ended the war in Korea. So challenge your assumptions and look at it through a different lens. And you see that there's a lot of rationale for what happened. Some of it might not be the rationale we would use in hindsight because, well, today we know more. Or the person in the decision-making loop wasn't aware of some of the things. I had a colleague at the War College that used to say, when the wrong thing happens, either you know something they don't, they know something you don't, or the message was garbled. And that happens a lot. And that's a very simplistic answer to a very wicked problem. Thank you for your question.
Fantastic. We're going to take one more question, and then we're going to turn to a slightly more informal conversation with the generals and admirals and SES to ask personal questions. They'll be informal, not separate to the forum, not attached to the forum. Move this to one right.
So much like has been brought up multiple times already, it's difficult to not draw comparisons between the withdrawal from Kabul and the withdrawal from Saigon. What policy and strategic solutions can we implement to ensure that a Kabul-Saigon style drawdown can never happen again?
Good question, guys.
I think one parallel to both of those, this is not an answer on how to, I don't have an answer on how to, if I had an answer on how to do it, I'd probably be writing to the president right now and saying, you need to be on your National Security Council. Is that in both cases, the conventional military forces that we've been working with, we believed they would be able to withstand the pressure from the insurgent military much longer than they did. That's not an answer on how to prevent it from happening. I do think it's intellectually fascinating how wrong we got the timeline for how rapidly the government in Afghanistan was going to collapse. You know, if you were following it closely, the expectations for how long. I don't know that I ever saw a legitimate intelligence estimate that said Giroa government in Afghanistan can last forever, or they can hold out the Taliban. But you watched the timeline for which it was predicted that Kabul would fall, and it rapidly shrank. I think that was perhaps the key intel failing. And it's if I say intel, I'm not casting all my blame on the intelligence community, because a lot of that information comes from guys on the ground. And I don't like to use the word intel failure because it lets everybody else off the hook. But I think that was one that we really, a key assumption that we absolutely got wrong in our withdrawal plans. And if you're a military planner, an assumption is something you identify in your plan, and you acknowledge that if it changes, if that assumption proves to be false, like I assume it's going to be sunny out, but it's not, then I need to change my plan. I need to carry an umbrella. And that was a key assumption that we really got wrong. I don't have an answer exactly on how to prevent it, but I think that was a key in both cases.
Yeah, I was going to say, there are key assumptions on the ground. There are key assumptions kind of at a theater level. And then there are assumptions that are happening in Washington. And they may not all be influenced the same way the military structure or the State Department has been influenced when they get up to the very top. And ultimately, and I'm not saying this is ultimately one person's decision, but ultimately what the President of the United States directs is what happens. Now, if the direction isn't very specific, there's a lot of interpretation to go on there, but there's also a great big machine that is moving to accomplish certain goals that were already set. And if it isn't told to adjust or given the information to adjust, it's not going to adjust. People sitting like me, but if I've been in Treasury still, we haven't had an intel function over there. They would have been pulled out, and what they thought about the situation might not even have fed into an assessment of what was going on.
I would also offer, every decision has trade-offs. You know, this gets back to there's no right or wrong, it's like better or worse. And so a trade-off would have been to, as we started to see, holy cow, you know, these provincial capitals are falling rapidly, could have paused. You could have said, all right, I'm going to surge tens of thousands of additional troops in to secure everything. Another trade-off could have been, I'm going to blow the timeline that I've established with the Taliban, and I'm going to say, I'm not leaving on the date that I told you I am. I'm going to stay longer, I'm going to bring in more forces, I'm going to establish security in and around Kabul in order to get people out in an orderly fashion. And that would have had some significant other negative ramifications. It probably would have restarted the war with the Taliban. I'm not saying that would have been a better solution, I'm just saying that any of these decisions do have trade-offs, and I think that our senior decision makers weigh those and make the decision that they think is best. It's hard to imagine a perfect solution.
I have one anecdote for you. First of all, I'm a Vietnam veteran, so I understand Vietnam pretty well. We had a situation where Henry Kissinger came to talk to us because one of our faculty at the Army War College had written up an article about the failure of this exact same thing. Well, not exact same thing, because we were airlifting people in Vietnam. Helicopters were landing on roofs to carry off those people who were already identified as being people that could leave, that would leave, that we were going to take care of. There was a good plan on the ground for when it would happen, how it would happen, and all the timeline in place. But the question came into the White House or to the State Department when Henry Kissinger was asked, what time do we cut it off? And he made the arbitrary decision, his words, not mine, because he had no information saying that we needed 5 more hours. He made the determination, I think it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, that the last helicopter would leave and we would be done. And there were people standing on that roof. We could have gotten a handful more helicopters and gotten a handful more people out of there. But he didn't know. He was on stage talking to us, tears coming down his eyes, saying, we made mistakes. It cost people lives. So we make mistakes. We do things because we are, as was mentioned, acting in the moment with the information we have. But it's not always the same. And in this case, when there were questions about, well, how many Americans are left? And I would ask for a show of hands, how many of you that have ever traveled overseas have signed up with the State Department to tell the State Department that you are going to be there, and if anything hits the fan while you're there, they know you're there? How many have done that? How many have traveled and not done that? Yeah. That's why we don't know. That's one of the reasons why we don't know, because a lot of people didn't want to leave. But then things changed, and last week I didn't want to leave, but today I got to leave. So we don't know. There's a lot of ambiguity here, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that was said, and I think that the bottom line is, one, this is an issue that's going to be debated probably for the rest of your life, and two, I'm not sure that you're ever going to know, because there's no single, you're never going to find a moment in time or a decision that was made where you say, if that decision had been different, then it all would have worked out fine. That doesn't exist. You look at the entire continuum of decision making, You know, you can go all the way back as Karen did, you can go all the way back to 2001 and look at the decision train of, you know, all the things that we did over the years, and all of those things led to August 31st, 2021. And, you know, you can say the process for issuing visas to special immigrants, the Afghans that we wanted to get out, was broken. It wasn't working. Several of us signed a letter to Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin in April, asking that the State Department and DOD work together to expedite the issuance of special immigrant visas. But the system was broken, it wasn't working. So that was one issue. It's not entirely clear, you know, that state and DOD were seeing things the same way. I would say that there's a question of how was the interagency working. And don't forget that this was the opening months of the Biden administration. Many of the key positions in the Biden administration were unfilled, or were being filled by people who were junior, and that you didn't have a team in place that really had gelled as a team and could make those kinds of decisions. I think that's an area that could be looked at. So there are a lot of different, there's a multitude of reasons why you got to the point that you got to in college. You know, can we say that, you know, if we fix these things, it will never happen again? No, you can't say that. You know, there's somebody, you know, there's the famous line about somebody saying, well, you know, I try never to make the same mistake twice. And the answer is, yeah, you make a new mistake each time. And that's the reality. And it goes back to all of the questions I think that we've been talking about, which is that you do your best, you work with the information that you have, you never have 100% of the information. Colin Powell's, if you ever read Colin Powell's book, if you haven't, I recommend it, called My American Journey. Great book, but he makes the comment in the book that the key to making a decision is to know when to make it. If you make a decision when you only have 60% of the information, you're probably acting too soon. If you wait till you have 100% of the information, you're acting too late. And so where is the sweet spot? Where is the right place where you can say, let's go, you know, now is the moment. It's all, you know, I mean, the question was, with all of your experience, how can you still screw up? The answer is, with all of our experience, we still screw up. That's the simple answer.
Good final answer to that question, and we're transitioning now, so I think you made a good transition point to you all are the solution for the future. You all have a career in front of you, and with good information and understanding of the complexity, you might be able to fast forward into positions where you have insights, and you can share your insights, and you can work those issues, and perhaps some of those past mistakes, we call them lessons learned, I call them lessons repeated, because we don't learn as well as we would like to learn. I worked several years ago on a program to try to help support executive decision-making in crisis, so that we could have those, not answers, but questions to ask. So when you're up there, and you're in the State Department, or you're there in the Department of Defense, and it's time to make a decision, you can figure out when, where, why, how, and what, and do it in a timely fashion. Boy, we wish you a lot of luck, but we're here to help you understand some of the complexities and maybe move us into a stronger position in the future. With that,
So now as we transition into this informal session, let's give our speakers a round of applause. And with that, any students who